Evenings were once made for stories like these, not the kind meant to excite or surprise, but the kind meant to be carried gently from one voice to another until the night itself took over, long before clocks mattered, before days were measured closely. People would settle in as the light faded, letting the world grow quiet around them. The fire would burn lower. The wind would move softly outside, and someone would begin to speak. These were not stories told in a hurry. They were told slowly, with pauses left open, so the listener could rest inside them. Tonight is much the same. There is nothing you need to remember, nothing you need to follow closely, no thread you must hold on to. These are old Irish stories, the kind that have been told many times, in many places, by people who were never in a rush to finish them. They come from a land where mist settles easily, where hills remember more than they reveal, and where time moves gently, even when sorrow passes through it. Some of these tales are quiet. Some are a little strange. Some carry sadness without raising their voice. All of them have already happened. They are remembered stories, spoken softly, as if the night itself were listening. You may notice moments where nothing seems to happen. That is part of the telling. In these stories, stillness matters. Waiting matters. The passing of time matters more than sudden events ever could. If your attention drifts, that is all right. If your thoughts wander, let them. These tales do not mind being half heard. They were never meant to be held tightly. Tonight, 3 stories will be shared. They are not connected to one another. They do not build toward anything. Each one stands on its own, like an old stone placed quietly back into the earth. The first is a tale remembered along lonely roads, of a figure sometimes seen at dusk, and sometimes not seen at all. The second speaks of daughters, and of waiting, and of a fate that arrived without being called. The last is an old story of endurance, of love stretched across years, and of voices carried over water and wind. They will be told gently, one after another, with space between them. There is no need to stay awake for all of them. You may listen to one, or part of one, or simply rest while the words continue on without you. That is how these stories have always been told. So settle in now, let the night grow a little quieter, and allow the story to begin, slowly, as it always has. In the days before anything changed, life in King O'Hara's household moved slowly. Not because it had to, but because there was no reason for it to move any other way. The king's hall stood a little apart from the village, resting on land that sloped gently toward the fields below. It was not a grand place. Its walls were sturdy rather than tall, its stone worn smooth by wind and rain rather than polished by care. Smoke often rose lazily from its hearth, drifting upward and dissolving into the open sky. Inside, the mornings were quiet. Light entered through narrow windows, touching the wooden floors in long, pale shapes. The fire from the night before was usually still alive, glowing softly beneath a thin layer of ash. Someone would stir it, add a piece of peat or wood, and the room would slowly warm again. King O'Hara rose early, as he always had. He moved without hurry, wrapping his cloak around his shoulders before stepping outside to look across the land. From where he stood, he could see fields that had been worked for generations. Stone fences ran their familiar lines across the hills, unchanged and dependable. Sheep moved slowly through the grass, their presence more felt than noticed. The land had its own rhythm, and the king followed it. His 3 daughters rose later, their days beginning gently. They shared the same rooms they had grown up in, rooms filled with small signs of ordinary life. Woven blankets rested at the foot of their beds. Simple wooden chests held clothes folded carefully, more for habit than necessity. Nothing here was extravagant. Nothing needed to be. The eldest daughter moved with quiet confidence. She had a steady way about her, shaped by years of watching and learning. In the mornings, she often helped prepare the hall for the day, arranging simple meals, checking that everything was in its place. Her movements were calm and practiced, as though she had all the time she needed. The second daughter followed close behind. She was thoughtful, observant, often pausing near windows or doorways, watching the way light shifted across the land. She noticed small changes. A field greener than the day before, a cloud lingering longer than usual. She spoke little in the mornings, preferring to let the day settle first. The youngest daughter lingered. She took her time waking, her thoughts slow to rise. When she did appear, she often carried a sense of ease with her, moving lightly through the hall, stopping to warm her hands near the fire or sit quietly beside her sisters. Her laughter came softly, never sudden. Meals were simple and unhurried. Bread broken by hand, warm bowls placed carefully on the table, voices kept low, not from caution, but from comfort. They spoke of small things, of the weather, of the fields, of tasks that needed doing, and those that could wait. No one felt pressed by time. Outside, the village followed its own familiar patterns. People passed along the road at a steady pace, nodding as they went. Doors opened and closed gently. Animals were led to pasture, then back again. The sound of daily life never rose above a calm murmur. Children played near the edge of the fields, their voices drifting on the air and fading just as easily. Older villagers sat together, mending tools or simply watching the day move forward. Everything had its place. In the afternoons, the daughters often walked together. They followed paths they had known since childhood, paths worn smooth by countless footsteps. Grass bent gently beneath them and rose again after they passed. Birds moved through the hedges without hurry, accustomed to human presence. They did not walk to arrive anywhere in particular. They walked because the day allowed it. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they did not. Silence never felt empty between them. In the evenings, the hall filled with softer light. The fire grew stronger again, its glow spreading across the stone walls. Shadows moved slowly, stretching and shrinking as the flames shifted. The air grew warm and still. King O'Hara sat with his daughters as night settled in. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, his words were measured and few. Life here had already taught them what they needed to know. As darkness deepened outside, the world did not disappear. It simply quieted. The wind moved gently along the walls. The land rested. The hall held its warmth. These were days that did not announce themselves. They passed quietly, one after another, unchanged and dependable, and no one yet sensed how precious they were. Days followed one another, without marking themselves, each one resembling the last just enough to feel familiar. The routines of the hall remained steady, shaped by habit rather than instruction, but small things began to feel slightly different. Not wrong, just not quite the same. It was first noticed in the mornings. The light that entered the hall seemed slower to settle, lingering longer near the windows before spreading across the floor. The fire from the night before sometimes needed more tending than usual, as though the warmth had not held quite as well. No one spoke of it at first. Such things were easy to dismiss. Weather changed. Seasons turned. The land was allowed its moods. The daughters continued their days as they always had. The eldest still moved through the hall with quiet certainty, though she paused more often now, standing still as if listening for something she could not quite hear. Her hands rested on tables or door frames a moment longer before moving on. The second daughter spent more time near the windows. She watched the fields with the same careful attention, but her gaze lingered now. The clouds seemed to drift differently. The wind changed direction more often than before. These were small observations, hardly worth mentioning, and yet she remembered them. The youngest daughter felt the change without understanding it. She slept longer. Her laughter came less frequently, softer when it did. Sometimes she sat near the fire without speaking, her eyes following the movement of the flames as though they were telling her something quietly. Outside, the village carried on. People worked their fields. Animals were led out and back again. Doors still opened and closed in the same gentle rhythm. But conversations grew shorter. Voices lowered without reason. Even the children's play seemed to quiet earlier in the evening. Nothing had happened. That was the strange part. There was no storm to point to. No loss. No warning. Just a feeling, faint and indistinct, that something was beginning to drift. King O'Hara noticed it too. He stood longer at the edge of the land in the mornings, his gaze moving slowly across the fields and hills. He listened to the wind, not for messages, but for changes in its tone. He spoke less at the table, his attention resting on his daughters more often than before. When he did speak, it was gently, asking how they slept, asking if they had noticed the weather, asking small questions that carried no weight. Evenings became quieter. The fire still burned warmly, but its light felt softer, less eager to push back the dark. Shadows stretched longer along the walls, settling in places they had not before. The daughters gathered closer together without meaning to. They shared the same bench, the same blanket, the same quiet. Sometimes when the wind moved just right, it carried sounds from far away. Not voices, just distant movement. The kind of sound that reminds you the world is larger than the place you stand. No one named their unease. In this land, not everything needed a name. The days continued. Morning, afternoon, evening. Life did not stop, but it began to feel as though it were gently leaning towards something unseen. And still, nothing had truly changed. Not yet. In time, the feeling that had lingered quietly in the hall began to settle into something familiar. Not fear, not certainty, just a knowing that no longer needed attention. The days continued much as they always had, but the household learned to move with a softer step. Voices stayed low without being asked. Doors were closed more gently. Even the fire seemed to burn with less movement, its flame slower, its warmth steady rather than bright. King O'Hara no longer stood at the edge of the land for long. He still rose early, still wrapped his cloak around his shoulders, still looked across the fields, but now his gaze rested closer to home. He watched the smoke from the hall rise into the air and thin as it drifted away. He listened to the quiet sounds of morning, the distant call of birds, the soft movement of wind through grass, and accepted them as they were. Inside, the daughters adjusted without speaking of it. The eldest took on fewer tasks, not because they were beyond her, but because she felt no need to fill every hour. She moved through the hall with a calm that came from restraint rather than effort. When she sat, she stayed seated longer. When she worked slowly, finishing only what needed finishing. The second daughter no longer watched the land for signs. She still noticed the weather, still observed the sky and the fields, but without expectation. She allowed the world to be uncertain, trusting that it would continue, whether she followed its changes or not. The youngest daughter found comfort in stillness. She spent long afternoons near the fire, or along the familiar paths outside the hall, sitting rather than walking, listening rather than speaking. Her thoughts moved gently, untethered from worry. When she smiled, it was quiet and unguarded, as though she had already let go of something unnamed. Meals grew simpler, not because supplies were scarce, but because simplicity felt right. Bread, warm broth, small portions eaten slowly. No one lingered at the table out of habit anymore. When the meal was finished, they rested. When they rested, they remained still. Outside, the village mirrored the same rhythm. Work was done carefully, not quickly. Fields were tended without ambition. People paused more often, leaning on fences, sitting on low stone walls. watching clouds move without following them. There were no gatherings to discuss what was happening. There was nothing to discuss. This was not a time for questions. It was a time for waiting. Evening settled earlier now. The light faded softly, as though the sun itself had learned not to rush. The fire was lit before darkness fully arrived, its glow spreading slowly across the walls, touching familiar objects. A wooden chair, a worn table, a folded cloth. Without changing them, the daughters sat together each night. Sometimes they spoke quietly. Sometimes they did not speak at all. Silence did not feel empty anymore. It felt complete. King O'Hara listened to the sounds of the hall as night deepened. The fire's gentle movement, the faint creak of wood settling, the distant hush of the land resting. He felt no urge to intervene. Whatever was coming would arrive in its own way. And so, the household learned the shape of waiting. Waiting without tension. Waiting without hope or fear. Waiting simply because time allowed it. Days passed. Then more days. Nothing dramatic announced itself. There was no moment when everything shifted at once. The change moved quietly, like mist settling across the land. So gradual it could not be measured. One morning, the eldest daughter did not rise with the light. There was no alarm in this. She slept peacefully, her breathing slow and steady. When she did wake, it was later than usual, and she smiled faintly, as though waking from a long, gentle dream. The second daughter spent more time indoors now, content to sit near the fire, her gaze unfocused, her thoughts moving slowly and without urgency. The youngest daughter hummed softly at times, a sound without words, without tune, just a presence that filled the space gently. King O'Hara watched them with a calm that surprised him. He did not feel panic. He did not feel loss. He felt something closer to reverence. These days, these moments, were not meant to be held tightly. They were meant to pass. The land seemed to understand this. The wind softened. The fields grew quiet. Even the sky felt lower, closer, as though the world were drawing inward rather than reaching outward. The hall remained warm. The fire burned steadily. The household continued, not resisting what was unfolding, not trying to shape it. They waited, not for an answer, not for a change. They waited because waiting had become part of living. And in that waiting, there was peace. Some stories do not end. They simply grow quiet. What became of King O'Hara's household was remembered for a time, then spoken of less often, until it rested fully in the land itself. The hall remained where it had always stood. The paths were still there. The wind continued to move through the fields, but the days that once filled that place belonged to another time. Stories like this are not carried forward for their events. They are carried for the feeling they leave behind. A sense of waiting, a sense of stillness, a reminder that not all changes announce themselves. When one story fades, another is always nearby. It waits patiently, not asking to be heard, until the moment feels right. So let this one rest now. Allow the quiet it leaves behind to remain for a while, like the warmth of a fire after the flames have lowered. And when you are ready, another old story will begin, just as gently and just as slowly. People who lived near the old roads learned to notice small things. The way mist settled earlier than expected. The way sound carried less at dusk. The way the evening seemed to pause before night fully arrived. These were not signs of danger. They were simply part of the land. The road itself was narrow, worn smooth by years of travel. Stone and dirt pressed flat by footsteps, hooves, and wheels long gone. It curved gently through low hills and open fields. Never straight, never in a hurry. Those who walked it in the evening did so calmly. They knew the path well. They had walked it many times before. As the light faded, the air grew cool, not cold, just softer. The wind moved slowly across the grass, not strong enough to bend it, only enough to remind it to move. It was usually then, as the day loosened its hold, that some people noticed him. Not clearly, not all at once. At first, it was only the sound, a faint rhythm, slow, even, hooves, not loud, not close, just present. Those who heard it often stopped walking, not from fear, from habit. They stood still, listened. The sound never rushed toward them. It never followed. When people looked, they did not always see anything. Sometimes there was only the road, the mist, the soft darkening of the sky. Other times, there was a shape, a horse, tall, still. Its coat was dark, though not black, the kind of dark that absorbed light rather than reflected it. The rider sat quietly, straight-backed, unmoving. No face was ever described the same way. Some said they could not see one at all. Others said it was there, but blurred, as if the mist refused to settle on it. The horse did not stamp, did not toss its head. It stood patiently. Those who saw the horseman rarely spoke at once. They did not run. They did not call out. Most waited. The horseman never raised a hand, never turned. After a while, sometimes only moments, sometimes longer, the mist would shift. The sound of hooves would soften, and the road would be empty again. People continued on their way. They reached home. They ate. They slept. The evening passed. The next day came as usual. No one fell ill. No one vanished. The sighting did not change the road, but it stayed with them, not as fear, as memory. After the first sightings, life did not change. That was what surprised people most. The road was still used. The fields were still worked. Evenings still arrived quietly. No warnings were given. No signs were placed. No fires burned brighter. No doors were barred. People spoke of the horseman only when the day was already ending. Never at noon. Never in full light. Only when the sky softened. Only when voices naturally lowered. They spoke carefully, not whispering, just slower. Some said the horseman had always been there, that the land had simply chosen to show him now. Others said he appeared only to those who noticed too much. those who walked without rushing, those who listened. There was no agreement, and there was no need for one. Those who saw him did not feel chased. They did not feel watched. They felt accompanied, as if something ancient had walked beside the road longer than anyone remembered. A few travellers began to pause on purpose. They would stop at the bend where the mist often gathered. They would wait. Sometimes nothing happened. Sometimes the road stayed empty. Quiet. Still. Other times, the sound returned. Hooves. Slow. Measured. Never closer than before. Never farther away. When the horseman appeared, the air felt heavier. Not with danger. With presence. The horse breathed softly. A faint cloud in the cooling air. The rider remained still. Hands resting low. Reins loose. No command given. People noticed details then. The way the horse's tack looked older than memory. The way the rider's cloak did not move with the wind. The way the shape felt complete, even when partly hidden. No one remembered him arriving. He was simply there. And when he left, there was no moment to point to. The mist shifted. The sound faded. And the road returned to itself. Those who lingered longest felt no regret. They walked home calmly. Their sleep was deep that night, untroubled. Dreams, if they came, were slow and distant. The next evening, the road waited again, not expectantly, just patiently. Over time, the road learned the rhythm of the sightings. Not every evening, not every traveller, only on nights when the air rested close to the ground, only when the light faded without colour. People stopped trying to predict it. They understood the horseman was not a thing to be summoned or avoided. He appeared when the road allowed it. Those who saw him more than once began to notice something else. He was never closer than before, and never farther away. The distance stayed the same, as if the space between was part of the meeting. The children were the least unsettled by him. They noticed the horse first, its size, its stillness. They asked simple questions. Is he waiting? Is he tired? Adults did not always answer, not because they were afraid, but because there was nothing certain to say. Elders spoke rarely, but when they did, their voices carried weight. They said the horsemen belonged to the road, that some paths remembered those who travelled them longest. They said not every presence was meant to speak. Some were meant only to remain. No one followed the horseman. The thought did not occur naturally. The road itself discouraged it. The mist thickened before anyone could step closer. The sound softened before footsteps could advance. It was understood, quietly, that the meeting was enough. As seasons passed, fewer people mentioned the sightings, not because they stopped happening, but because they had become part of the land's breathing. The road remained safe. Travellers arrived home as expected. Fires were lit. Meals were eaten. Life continued. And still, on certain evenings, when the mist settled just right, the horseman stood where he always had, waiting, not for travellers, not for company, but for the road to remember itself. Eventually, people stopped asking who he was. They accepted that not every presence needed a name. Some things endured without explanation. And the road continued to wind gently through the land, holding its silence and its watcher, until neither felt separate anymore. In time, even the stories grew quieter. People still walked the road. The mist still settled. Evenings still softened into night. But fewer words were used. Those who remembered the horseman no longer tried to explain him. They did not describe his face. They did not count how many times they had seen him. They simply remembered that the road had once been shared. Sometimes, when the mist moved just right, a traveller would pause, not because they expected to see anything, but because the place felt familiar, as though something patient still lingered there. They would stand for a moment longer than needed, listen to the quiet, then continue on. The road asked for nothing. The night arrives calmly. The land rests. And whatever once stood beside the road stands no longer apart from it. The story ends the way it always has, quietly. And the night continues on, just as gently as before. Long ago, when the land was quieter, there lived a king named Lear. He did not rule loudly. He did not fill his days with command. His greatest joy was his children. 4 of them, 3 sons and 1 daughter. They lived near a wide stretch of water, where the air always carried a softness, even on cold days. The lake rested calmly most mornings, its surface pale and still, as though listening. The children grew up knowing that water. They walked beside it often. They sat near it in the evenings. They learned its moods without being taught. The eldest son moved with care. He watched over the others without speaking of it. He noticed when the wind changed, when the light shifted. The second son laughed easily. His voice carried across the water, light and warm. He filled quiet moments without effort. The third son followed close behind. He learned by watching, by listening, by waiting. And the youngest, their sister, she was gentle in all things. She spoke softly. She moved slowly. She seemed to understand the world without needing to question it. Their days were unhurried. They rose with the light. They ate together. They walked the land and returned home again. Nothing pressed them forward. Their father watched them often, not with worry, with gratitude. The land seemed to rest more easily when they were near. Birdsong lingered longer. The wind softened. Even the water seemed calmer. People remembered those days as peaceful ones, not because nothing ever went wrong, but because nothing needed to happen. In the evenings, the children gathered near the water. They listened to its quiet movement. They skipped stones. They watched the sky deepen into dusk. Their voices lowered as night approached. The lake reflected the fading light gently, never sharply. The world seemed to slow with them. No one yet knew how long this calm would last. It did not keep the horseman forever, and it did not let him go all at once. Like all things shaped by time, he became part of the land's memory. Not seen, not heard, only felt. And that was enough. The road still curves gently through the fields. Grass bends beneath passing feet. Mist settles and lifts again. Even now, nothing rushes there. The night arrives calmly. The land rests. And whatever once stood beside the road stands no longer apart from it. The story ends the way it always has, quietly. And the night continues on, just as gently as before. Long ago, when the land was quieter, there lived a king named Lear. He did not rule loudly. He did not fill his days with command. His greatest joy was his children. 4 of them. 3 sons and 1 daughter. They lived near a wide stretch of water, where the air always carried a softness, even on cold days. The lake rested calmly most mornings, its surface pale and still, as though listening. The children grew up knowing that water. They walked beside it often. They sat near it in the evenings. They learned its moods without being taught. The eldest son moved with care. He watched over the others without speaking of it. He noticed when the wind changed, when the light shifted. The second son laughed easily. His voice carried across the water, light and warm. He filled quiet moments without effort. The third son followed close behind. He learned by watching, by listening, by waiting. And the youngest, their sister, she was gentle in all things. She spoke softly. She seemed to understand the world without needing to question it. Their days were unhurried. They rose with the light. They ate together. They walked the land and returned home again. Nothing pressed them forward. Their father watched them often, not with worry, with gratitude. The land seemed to rest more easily when they were near. Birdsong lingered longer. The wind softened. Even the water seemed calmer. People remembered those days as peaceful ones, not because nothing ever went wrong, but because nothing needed to happen. In the evenings, the children gathered near the water. They listened to its quiet movement. They skipped stones. They watched the sky deepen into dusk. Their voices lowered as night approached. The lake reflected the fading light, gently, never sharply. The world seemed to slow with them. No one yet knew how long this calm would last. But in those early days, before loss, before waiting, before time stretched thin, the children of King Lear belonged fully to the land, and the land held them gently. As the seasons passed, the children grew, not quickly, not in any way that drew attention. They grew the way the land did, quietly, without announcement. Their routines stayed much the same. Mornings began with soft light over the water. Afternoons were spent walking the familiar paths. Evenings always brought them back to the lake. The water became a place of comfort. They learned where it was shallow, where stones rested beneath the surface, where reeds moved gently with the wind. They spoke to one another there, sometimes about small things, sometimes about nothing at all. Silence never felt empty. King Lear watched from a distance. He did not follow them closely. He trusted the land. He trusted the quiet. When he joined them, he sat nearby and listened. The water reflected his children clearly then. 4 figures beside the shore. Their shapes steady. Their laughter soft. People in the nearby lands spoke of the king's children kindly. They said the lake seemed calmer since the children had grown there, that the air felt lighter when they passed. No one felt uneasy. There was no reason to. When night came, the children returned home together. They slept deeply. Dreams came slowly, if at all. Then, without warning, life shifted. Not sharply, not cruelly, just differently. King Lear took a new wife. She arrived quietly. There was no celebration that echoed across the land. No sudden change in the hall. She moved carefully, spoke gently, watched more than she spoke. At first, nothing felt wrong. The children were polite. The new queen was courteous. Meals continued. Walks continued. But the evenings by the lake grew fewer. Not forbidden, just delayed. The children noticed first. They found reasons to return. Small excuses. Moments stolen from the day. The water still welcomed them. But something in the air felt thinner now. Their sister felt it most clearly. She stood longer at the water's edge. She touched its surface gently. She listened more than before. King Lear felt the change, but could not name it. The land still looked the same. The lake still rested quietly. And yet, something had shifted. The children did not speak of it. They stayed close to one another. They kept their voices low. They held to routine. Days passed. Then one morning, they were called to the lake. Not urgently, not sharply, just called. They walked together, as they always had. The air was still, the water calm. Nothing yet suggested that this walk would be remembered differently. They stood by the shore, and for a moment, everything felt as it always had. The lake was quiet that morning, not unusually so, just calm in the way it often was. The water lay smooth and pale, reflecting the sky without effort. A light mist rested close to the surface, moving slowly, as if unsure whether to rise or remain. The children stood together at the edge. They did not speak at first. They listened. The sound of water, touching stone, the faint movement of air, the distant call of a bird. Nothing felt dangerous. Their stepmother stood a short distance behind them. Her voice, when she spoke, was gentle. Too gentle. She told them to come closer to the water, to look at their reflections, to see how much they had grown. The children did as they were asked. They trusted easily. They had always lived in trust. As they leaned toward the lake, the mist thickened slightly. Not suddenly. Not enough to alarm. The air felt cooler then. Heavier. Their sister felt it first. She reached for her brother's hands, held them tightly. The words that followed were spoken quietly, not shouted, not forced. They settled into the air like frost. The children felt the shift before they understood it. Their bodies grew lighter. Their feet lost their hold on the ground. There was no pain, only a sense of movement. And then, stillness. When the mist lifted, the shore was empty. The lake remained, and on its surface, 4 white shapes drifted quietly. Swans. Their feathers caught the soft light. Their bodies moved gently with the water. They floated. The world held its breath. The queen stepped away. The spell had been cast. Its words already fading. Time resumed its slow movement. The swans drifted together, close, their heads turning toward one another. Their eyes held recognition. Their bond remained. They stayed near the shore for a long while, as if waiting. As the day passed, the sun rose higher. The water warmed slightly. The mist dissolved. But the swans did not leave. When evening came, they rested together near the reeds, their bodies close, their movements calm and measured. They slept on the water. Dreams, if they came, were distant. Days turned into weeks, weeks into years. The swans moved as the seasons asked them to. They followed the water's slow path. They learned the currents. They learned the quiet. They spoke only to one another. Their voices, when they sang, were not loud. They were gentle, clear, full of longing. People who passed by the lake paused when they heard them. They did not know why. They only felt the calm. Time continued. The children did not age as others did. They remained as they were, held in between. Their father waited. King Lear searched the shore. He called out. He listened. But the lake answered only with quiet movement. Years passed like water beneath wings. The swans were carried from one place to another, from lake to sea, from shore to distant islands, always together, always calm, waiting. The years continued to move quietly over the water. The swans travelled as the currents carried them, from sheltered lakes to open sea, from familiar shores to distant wind-shaped islands. They learned the sound of waves at night, the pull of tides beneath their bodies, the long silence that comes only far from land. Through every place, they remained together. They slept close. They drifted side by side. They sang to one another when the nights felt longest. Their voices carried softly over the water, not calling for rescue, not calling for change, simply remembering. Time passed differently for them. Storms came and went. Seasons turned without marking them. The world shifted, slowly and without notice. Far away, King Lear aged. He never stopped listening for his children, never stopped walking the shore when the day grew quiet, never stopped hoping the water might answer him. One evening, as the light faded gently, the sound reached him. A song, clear, soft, familiar. He followed it without hurry. The shore welcomed him quietly. The water lay calm, and there, resting near the edge, were the swans. They came closer, not rushing, not afraid. When they sang, the king knew. He knelt by the water and listened. The world held still. The years fell away. The spell, old and tired now, loosened its hold. The swans grew still. The water calmed. And where they had rested, the children lay once more, changed, weakened, but returned. King Lear gathered them gently. There were no tears in that moment, only relief, only love. The children did not remain long. Their time had stretched far beyond what the world usually allows. They rested quietly in their father's arms. And then they let go. The lake grew calm again. The wind softened. The land accepted what had been returned to it. People say the water there still carries a gentleness, that the air remains quieter than elsewhere, that birds rest longer on its surface. No one speaks loudly near that shore, not from sadness, from respect. The story does not ask to be remembered loudly. It has already been carried far enough. And so, the night settles once more. The water rests. The land grows quiet. Time moves on. Slowly. Without urgency. Just as it always has.